Hi guys, you ready for chapter 2 of a series of unfortunate events? Bad beginning. When we last left the orphans, they were walking with Mr. Poe to the unknown. They just found out that their entire lives had changed, and they were about to find out what was going to happen next. And Mr. Poe was very insensitive whenever he was talking to the orphans about what their next thing would be. And he told them that he was not only in charge of their fortune, but he was also in charge of where they would be staying. So can you imagine how those kids felt holding Mr. Poe's hand, walking to the unknown? It had to have been very, very scary. Chapter 2. It's useless for me to describe to you how terrible Violet, Klaus, and even Sunny felt in the time that followed. If you've ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it. For the Baudelaire children, it was, of course, especially terrible because they had both lost their parents at the same time. And for several days, they felt so miserable that they could scarcely get out of bed. Klaus found that he had little interest in books anymore, and the gears in Violet's inventive brain seemed to have stopped. And even Sunny, who of course was too young to really understand what was going on, bit things with a lot less enthusiasm. Of course, it didn't make things any easier that they had lost their home as well, and all of their possessions. And as I'm sure you know, to be in one's own room and one's own bed can often make a very bleak situation a little bit better. But the beds of the Baudelaire orphans had been reduced to charred rubble. Mr. Poe had taken them to the remains of the Baudelaire mansion to see if anything had been unharmed, and the only thing they saw was terrible things. Violet's microscope had fused together in the heat of the fire, and Klaus's favorite pen had turned into ash, and all of Sunny's teething rings had melted. Here and there the children could see traces of the enormous home that they once loved, fragments of their grand piano, an elegant bottle in which Mr. Baudelaire kept brandy, the scorched cushion of the window seat where their mother liked to sit and read. Their home was destroyed. The Baudelaires had to recuperate from their terrible loss in the Poe household, which really wasn't very agreeable at all. Mr. Poe was scarcely at home because he was very busy attending to the Baudelaire affairs, and when he was home, he was often coughing so much that he could barely even carry on a conversation. Mrs. Poe purchased clothing for the orphans that was grotesque colors, and it was very itchy fabric. And the two Poe children, Edgar and Albert, were loud and obnoxious boys with whom the Baudelaires had to share a tiny little room that had some kind of smell that smelled like a disgusting flower. Even given the surroundings, the children had mixed feelings when, over a dull dinner of boiled chicken, boiled potatoes, and the word blanched here means boiled, string beans, Mr. Poe announced that they were to leave this household the next morning. Good, said Albert, who had a piece of potato stuck in between his teeth. Now we can get our room back. I'm tired of sharing it. Violet and Klaus are always moping around and are never any fun. And the baby bites people, Edgar said, tossing a chicken bone to the floor as if he were an animal in a zoo and not the son of a well-respected member of the banking community. Where will we go? Violet asked nervously. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to say something, but erupted into a brief bit of coughing. I have made arrangements, he said finally, for you to be raised by a very distant relative of yours who lives on the other side of town, and his name is Count Olaf. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another, unsure of what to think. On one hand, they didn't want to live with the Poes anymore, and on the other hand, they'd never even heard of a guy named Count Olaf. How could they possibly be related to him? Your parents' will, Mr. Poe said, instructs that you be raised in the most convenient way possible. Here in the city, you'll be used to your surroundings, and this Count Olaf is the only relative who lives within the urban limits. Klaus thought this over for a minute as he swallowed a chewy bit of bean. But our parents never mentioned Count Olaf to us. Just how exactly is he related? Mr. Poe sighed and looked down at Sunny, who was biting a fork, and listened closely. He is either a third cousin 4 times removed or a fourth cousin 3 times removed. He is not your closest relative on the family tree, but he is the closest geographically, and that's the reason why I've chosen him. If he lives in the city, Violet said, why didn't our parents ever invite him over or something? We should know him. Possibly because he was very busy, Mr. Poe said. He's an actor by trade and often travels around the world with various theater companies. I thought he was a count, Klaus said. He's both a count and an actor, Mr. Poe said. Now, I don't mean to cut short our dinner, but you children have to pack up your things, and I have to return to the bank to do some more work. Like your new legal guardian, I myself am very busy. The three Baudelaire children had more questions for Mr. Poe, but he had already stood up from the table and with a slight wave of his hand departed from the room. They heard him coughing into a handkerchief, and then the floor creaked shut as he left the house. Well, Mrs. Poe said, you three had better start packing. Edgar and Albert, come on here and help me set the table. The Baudelaire orphans went to the bedroom and glumly packed their few little belongings that they had. Klaus looked distantly at the ugly shirt that Mrs. Poe had bought for him, and he folded it and put it in a small suitcase. And Violet looked around the cramped, smelly room in which they had been living, and Sonny crawled around, solemnly biting each of Edgar and Albert's shoes, leaving small teeth marks in each one so that she would not be forgotten. From time to time, the Baudelaire children looked at one another, but with their future such a mystery, they could think of nothing to say, and at bedtime they tossed and turned all night long, scarcely getting any sleep between the loud snoring of Edgar and Albert and their own very worried thoughts. Finally, Mr. Poe knocked on the door and stuck his head into the bedroom. Rise and shine, Baudelaires, he said. It's time for you to go to Count Olaf's. Violet looked around the crowded bedroom, and even though she didn't like it, she felt very nervous about leaving. Do we have to go right this minute? Mr. Poe opened the mouth to speak, but had to cough a few times before he could. Yes, you do. I'm dropping you off on the way to the bank, so we need to leave as soon as possible. Please get dressed, get out of bed, he said very briskly. The word briskly here means quickly, so as to get the Baudelaire children out of the house very fast. The Baudelaire children left the house. Mr. Poe's automobile rumbled along the cobblestone streets of the city toward the neighborhood where Count Olaf lived. They passed horse-drawn carriages and motorcycles along Dolan Drive. They passed the Fickle Fountain, an elaborately carved monument that occasionally spat out water in which children liked to play. They passed out an enormous pile of dirt where the Royal Gardens once stood. But before too long, Mr. Poe drove his car down a narrow alley lined with houses made of pale brick and stopped halfway down the block. Here we are, Mr. Poe said in a voice undoubtedly meant to be friendly. Your new home. The Baudelaire children looked out and saw the prettiest house on the block. The bricks had been cleaned very well, and through the wide and open windows one could see an assortment of well-groomed plants. Standing in the doorway with her hand on her shiny brass doorknob was an older woman, smartly dressed, who was smiling so big at the children, and in one hand she carried a flower pot. Hello there, she called out. You must be the children Count Olaf is expecting. Violet opened the door of the automobile and got out to shake the woman's hand. It felt very firm and very warm. And for the first time in a long time, Violet felt as if her life and the lives of her siblings might turn out well after all. Yes, she said, yes, we are. I'm Violet, and this is my brother Klaus, and this is my sister Sonny, and this is Mr. Poe, who's been arranging things for us since the death of our parents. Yes, I've heard about the horrible accident, the woman said, as everyone said every time that they met them. I'm Justice Strauss. Well, that's an unusual name, Klaus remarked. Well, it's my title, not my first name. I serve as a judge on the High Court. How fascinating. And are you married to Count Olaf? Goodness, no, Justice Strauss said. I don't actually even know him. He's just my next-door neighbor. The children looked from the well-scrubbed house of Justice Strauss to the dilapidated one next door. The bricks were stained with soot and grime, and there were only two small windows, which were closed with the shades drawn even tight, even though it was such a nice day. Rising above the windows was a tall and dirty tower that tilted slightly to their left. The front door needed to be repainted, and carved in the middle of it was an image of an eye. The entire building sagged to the side like crooked teeth. Oh, said Sonny, and everyone knew what she really meant. She really meant, what a terrible place. I don't want to live here at all. Yes, said Justice Strauss, gesturing to her flower pot. Perhaps one day you could come over and help me with my gardening. That would be very pleasant, Violet said, very sadly. It would, of course, be very pleasant to help Justice Strauss with her gardening, but Violet could not help thinking that it would be far more pleasant to live in Justice Strauss's house instead of Count Olaf's. What kind of man, Violet wondered, would carve an image of an eye right into his front door? Mr. Poe tipped his hat to Justice Strauss, who smiled at the children and disappeared into her lovely house. Klaus stepped forward and knocked on Count Olaf's door, his knuckles rapping right in the middle of the carved eyeball. There was a pause, and then the door quickly opened, and the children got to see Count Olaf for the very first time. "Hello, hello, hello," Count Olaf said in a wheezy little voice. He was very tall and very thin. He was dressed in a gray suit that had many dark stains on it. His face was unshaven, and rather than two eyebrows, like most human beings had, he really just had one long one. His eyes were very, very shiny, which made him look hungry and angry. "Hello, my children. Please step into your new home and wipe your feet outside so no mud gets inside." As they stepped into the house, Mr. Poe behind them, the Baudelaire orphans realized what a ridiculous thing Count Olaf had just said. The room in which they found themselves was the dirtiest one they had ever seen, and a little bit of mud from outdoors wouldn't have made any difference at all. Even by the dim light of the one bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling, the three children could see that everything in the room was absolutely filthy. From the stuffed head of a lion, which was nailed to the wall, to the bowl of apple cores, which sat on the small wooden table, Klaus willed himself not to cry as he looked around. "This room looks like it needs a little work," Mr. Poe said, peering around in the gloom. "I realize that my humble home isn't as fancy as the Baudelaire mansion," Count Olaf said, "but perhaps with a little bit of your money we could fix it up a little nicer." Mr. Poe's eyes widened in surprise, and his coughs echoed in the dark room before he spoke. "The Baudelaire fortune will not be used for such matters. In fact, it will not be used at all until Violet is of age." Count Olaf turned to Mr. Poe with a glint in his eye like an angry dog, and for a moment Violet thought he was going to strike Mr. Poe right in the face. But then he swallowed, and the children could see his Adam's apple bob in his skinny throat and shrugged his patchy shoulders. "All right, then. It's all the same to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Poe, for bringing them in. Children, I will now show you to your room." "Goodbye, Violet, Klaus, Sonny," Mr. Poe said, stepping back through the front door. "I hope you will be very happy here. I will continue to see you occasionally, and you can always contact me at the bank if you have any questions at all." "But we don't even know where the bank is," Klaus said. "I have a map of the city," Count Olaf said. "Goodbye, Mr. Poe." And he leaned forward to shut the door. And the Baudelaire orphans were too overcome with despair to even get a last glimpse of Mr. Poe. They now wished they could all stay at the Poe household, even though it smelled bad. Rather than looking at the door then, the orphans looked down and saw that although Count Olaf was wearing shoes, he wasn't wearing any socks. They could see in the space of his pale skin, tattered between his cuff and his black shoes, that Count Olaf had an image of an eye tattooed on his ankle, matching the exact eye on the front door. They wondered how many other eyes were in Count Olaf's house, and whether for the rest of their lives they could always feel as though Count Olaf were watching them, even when he wasn't nearby. That was chapter 2. All right, so we got to meet Count Olaf. Count Olaf, it'd be interesting to talk to you guys and see what you think of his character so far. So he was like a really skinny guy, right? They said he looked like skinny. He had kind of an angry face. And one of the very first things he said to Mr. Poe was that he could use some of the money from the children to fix up his yucky house. And so you can tell already that he might have another motive in having the children there. The children thought that where they were before in Mr. Poe's house, that it was gross or yucky and it smelled bad and they didn't like to share a room. But already, just by taking a few steps into the doorway of this new home, they already miss Mr. Poe's house, even with the two children that weren't very nice in the room that was stinky and crowded. So it's interesting the perspective there they got. They weren't really appreciating what they had until they moved on to this new place. And now they're like, oh my goodness, I missed that other place. This is going to be awful. Whenever they looked around the room, they saw dust and dirt, and they saw a bowl of apple cores. That's interesting. If you walked into someone's house and you saw a bowl of old, disgusting apple cores sitting in the bowl, what would you be thinking? It's an interesting setting, huh? One thing you'll notice in this book is that the characters will remain the same. We'll get a few characters here and there, but the main characters remain the same. But the setting changes almost every chapter. Something new happens and where they are located. The first chapter, this setting was mainly at the beach, right? Or in Mr. Poe's car, but mainly at the beach. The second chapter, where are we at? Where's the setting? At Olaf's house. It's the main part of the setting that leaves where we will continue on. When they first arrived to the house, they met Justice Klaus that lived next door, and they were so excited. It looked like a warm, friendly person, and clean and exciting with the plants, and then they got so disappointed about where they were. So it's an interesting thing to think about. I know that I talked to you last time about this book. This book isn't for everyone, but it's an interesting book because it's just like what it says. It's not a happy fairy tale or a silly story. It's a story where you actually have to think about, what would I do in that circumstance? How would I be feeling? Is there something different that I would do than what the orphans did? So I want you to continue to think about that, and we'll see what happens on the next chapter.